it really is a tale of two cities. If you talk about the family and children, it's been amazing. Sarasota has gone from any given night having 145 children, 142 children in a car behind a big box mall somewhere in the county, to having 0 children in cars at night, and having a response rate that might have been 3 or 4 weeks to get somebody help. Now response rates being measured in minutes. And so on the family and children's side, there's probably nobody doing it better than what's going on in the community of Sarasota. So that's fabulous. Mm-hmm. And then you look at the other side, absolutely nothing done on the chronic street men and women, the visual homelessness, if you will, street homelessness, unsheltered. Those are all the same names for basically the same group of people that are experiencing homelessness. And candidly, that's been horrible. There's no other way. It's a failure. A year ago, almost to the day, I got up in a joint meeting of the city and county and said, if you choose not to do something, you are making a choice. And in particular, the city chose to pull out and not even listen to the best site. Wayne was ready to present the best site, the one that was cost effective, that could open fast, that could open quick, that already provides homeless services. And they chose not to want to even hear the presentation, the city did. Mm-hmm. And that's when you choose not to even want to hear a presentation, you know you're in trouble.
Right. Well, in your initial recommendations, you were kind of adamant about having that facility, come as you are facility, close to all the services, and I can totally understand the logic behind that. Given that the city is having such a problem with not wanting to do that, is there any possibility of doing come as you are shelter or somewhere else in the county? Could it still work, even though it's not the optimal idea?
24/7 programs really work, and the locations do matter, and it's there. And so we got 2 good locations that we're presenting. Now, if the politics fails logic, if the politics fails common sense, then I do think we've also brought in a third set of alternatives, which would be right outside the city, that it would be outside so in other words, you wouldn't have to have the city and county to agree. And again, this is my recommendation. The commission's not approved it or talked about it yet, but I think there's 3 or 4 locations just right outside the city that would be within a quarter mile. They're not perfect. They're not the best sites, but they're workable. They're doable. They have a couple downsides to them, but it's better that than nothing. And that's probably the big takeaway is in the last year here. How did it work for you? The city did a bunch of gimmicks. I mean, they passed ordinances, they did sweeps, they've hired 2 or 3 people. Candidly, I think they're wasting money on that. They've done a bunch of gimmicks on the street. They've done gimmicks with the Merchants Association. So they've tried all these things and they've set up teams. And you know what? None of them have worked. And we predicted none of them would work because they've not worked everywhere else in the United States when you try that.
What about this idea, the 3-to-1 plan that the organizers put together using the Salvation Army?
It has a lot of merit. 3-to-1 has a lot of merit. That's going to be my number one alternative to look at. Has a lot of merit. It's right across from the Crisis Stabilization Unit, which right off the start is one of your most important co-features if you were trying to align. In fact, in San Antonio, we literally started by building that first before we built the housing. And we built them right across 200 feet from each other, and so that would be an ideal place to start. It has 220 permitted beds with the surge ability to go higher. It has current homeless services there, not a lot, because over time the Salvation Army has sort of morphed into doing some other things. But that's a very logical location, and so we want to start with that. The downside of that site, technically it's the best location, and you go in with permitted beds, so that's the good. The downside of that is going to be a very costly site to do, very, very costly, because you have to buy out Salvation Army and then relocate their services, which are very important to this community. And then you're going to have to rehab that building, go in and redesign the internal buildings, which is mostly just opening it up. It's actually not creating more, it's going to be tearing down walls, but those walls are so durable in there. They're hurricane type walls. and you got plumbing and electrical built in cinder block that has cement-filled walls. And so the rehab cost to get that building to a operationally safe type of building is going to at least be $1.5 million. And I'm saying that's just a quick down and dirty. I think the number will be higher.
Why can't we just use it as is?
Anyway, it's a safety issue. It's a functionality safety. There's so many nooks and crannies in that building because of the way the program are. You need to be able to open that up for safety, so both the volunteers and people that are staffing the building can look down corridors and see everybody. That's very, very important, because what you don't want to do is go into a facility and suddenly start having violent altercations. Because in the world of homeless, altercations happen. That's a real life thing. It happens and the question is, do you want that in a street in an uncontrolled environment, or do you want it in a controlled environment that reduces the number of altercations? They'll still happen, and reduce the magnitude of the altercation. But if you have a lot of hidden nooks and crannies in the facility, those will become very violent, and that's just known from anywhere in the United States historically. So that's why the way the building is laid out, it needs some significant improvements to make it a safe operational building.
Was that building initially for homeless, a chronically homeless building?
Yes, the Salvation Army, again, it was before my time, but from my understanding of reading history and talking to people who were here and worked through that process, originally in the mid-90s, when they went through that process, it was to develop programming for homeless individuals. If the community recalls, in about 2004, the behavioral health community was dealing with a large number of Marchman Acts going into the jail, and these are folks who are unable to care for themselves or a danger to others because of their substance abuse, and they weren't being arrested, they were being held on a civil type order initiated by the police, going into the jail for a matter of hours and then being released. And the downtown community and business community were having issues with folks' intoxication level and on the street, and so the community responded, developed the CARD initiative in our community, which opened the addictions receiving facility, a 24/7 Marchman Act facility, and so there was an alternative place to take folks rather than the jail. It also created the Viper program, and that's primarily where Salvation Army came into play. We said we need a place to run this residential Viper program it's a substance abuse treatment program, and we need beds to be able to do that. And so Salvation Army carved out space in their facility, and the program, had extraordinary success. Early on, the evaluations have been really high of the success of the program, such that the waiting list to get into the program began to be an issue. And so the Salvation Army then began developing kind of waiting for Viper programs. So they have programs that are their own substance abuse treatment programs before you get into the Viper program, because they want to be able to respond when somebody's ready to seek sobriety. They want to, not tell them they have to wait. And so they've created, kind of really successful programming in the facility for substance abuse treatment. Now, some of those beds certainly might be homeless individuals for not the programming, but it really has taken kind of 160, 180 beds right offline for your direct unsheltered population that Robert was talking about earlier, those folks who are just living in the streets. And so they have capacity issues of bringing folks in even just for 12 hours, which of course is not what we want to see folks brought in and have a place 24/7, because we believe that's where you're going to get, and experience tells us that's where you're going to get recovery and addressing the root causes. If you bring somebody in at night, release them in the morning, your ability to gain success in addressing root cause of homelessness is really difficult. So really the CEO 3-to-1 plan says relocate those substance abuse treatment beds, relocate those Viper beds and the other substance abuse treatment beds that we were thankful the Salvation Army did at the time, but let's find another location for those where they can operate successfully. They don't need to be in that location. They don't need to be in the only place that's permitted 220 beds for homeless individuals. That would then create capacity in the system to deal with the folks that are on the streets here. Let's remember the Salvation Army is part of a national, kind of international organization, and they have a model. And its model is different than a come as you are, where we accept everybody no matter how they present
Very
themselves.
good point.
And so I'm not sure what type of program, what type of the homeless population they were trying to design for back in the early 90s. You know what I mean? Where what we're saying is we've got to develop a facility today that brings all segments in, and not just a certain segment who may be more ready than another set of the population.
And that's a real good point. A lot of Salvation Armies are very similar to Union rescue missions around the country. Is that you have to be clean and sober, and some even go so far as you got to be clean and sober and already have a job, and then we'll bring you in. Well, what we're finding, especially with the post-traumatic stress out of the military folks, especially the job, restructuring, and this was long before 2008, when the economy, structural, some of the structural job creation we have is going overseas. So when all of that stuff happens, I think what you have is a lot of people on the street now that were never envisioned 20 years ago. And then you have the mental health. You've heard me talk before about the Ronald Reagan years. The day Ronald Reagan went in, 1980, we had 475,000 federally funded mental health beds across the United States. And in this really strange far right, far left working together, the far left had watched One of Them Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and thought it was a documentary, and they wanted to deinstitutionalize. And there was a horrible facility in Long Island, New York, that everybody kept pointing to, which is closed. I've gone to the facility. It is locked up, boarded up, and it was horrible. But not all the facilities were horrible. We should have fixed facilities, not defunded facilities. And so now you have less than 100,000 federally funded beds. So where do those 75,000 people go? They go to the streets, they go to the jail, they go to the emergency room, they go to the parks.
I've heard you mention Housing First before, and I know some of your programs have a Housing First initiative involved with them. And I've heard you say that in Sarasota it's not viable because there's just not the affordable housing in which to do that. In Sarasota, real estate has been one of our key industries for a very, very long time. As long as we continue to view real estate as just a commodity, do you think we're going to continue to just see homelessness on the rise because people are going to be priced out of being able to afford a place to live?
Well, this is happening all across Florida. It's happening in the beach areas of Texas. It's happened in Southern California, actually before it happened in Florida. Is you have a community that's based off the service sector, tourism. So you have very expensive needs of condos and high-end hotels, but then you're paying minimum wage for many of the service jobs. And so where do they live? So you have many theme parks, for example, now creating their own housing complex for their own employees because they can't get employees to live in an affordable area. Housing First is one of the solutions. It's not the only solution. And I don't think Sarasota can afford the voucher program. There are two types of Housing First, voucher and build your own housing stock. If you do voucher, that means you have to have an inventory to use it. We have found just in the last update, in the last 3 months here of doing research, we are finding people who have federal vouchers in hand and can't find it affordable. They actually have the voucher. So a voucher Housing First program is not even working now, so why even talk about it? Now, building your housing stock, building 200 or 300 or 400 units over time, you can't do it overnight, makes a lot of sense. And I've called for that. I called for that in the first report. But you need to have the city put some money into it. You need to have the city, and they're the ones who keep espousing it, they need to put the money into it and they need to pick a location. And what I think they're finding is Housing First also has the same NIMBYism problems that Come As You Are shelter. I mean, whatever you call it, if it's Housing First for homeless or Come As You Are for homeless, they're still seeing the NIMBYism. And the fact that for 2 years they've talked about it and have yet to have one vote that to me seems that that's really an insincere position they're taking. We did our housing first in San Antonio using the low-income tax credits, and it worked fabulous. It's one of the few federal programs that's very successful, that both the far right and far left said, you know what, that's one of those programs that really works well, and you don't get that much. You know, you normally get one side saying it works and the other, we don't like it, or the other side says that's not quite what our views are in life. But it's one of the very few programs, so let's go for one of those. Let's start bidding on those. You're not going to win every one of them, but if you bid every 2 or 3 cycles, you're going to get one or so every often. And let's get started. And you don't need to build 400 tonight. Let's go for 80 units and let's get started.
There have been a lot of communities who've been developing tiny house villages,
Right.
and things like that. Like everything, it's not the solution, but it's a solution that people are using.
Yeah.
Does it have viability here in Sarasota where you could set up a village like that?
Yeah, you could. And again, it's just one of many techniques. And I've been involved with several places that have had those. And Pinellas, we in essence have the place. Sometimes people call it Tent City, but it's officially its name is Pinellas Hope, and it's run by Catholic Charities. And they have several units there that are the tiny house. They were doing tiny houses before people called them tiny houses. They can work. They're part of a solution. They can be done. We've used them in some places. But again, somebody just has to say, here's where we're going to put them. And that's what the city needs to do. They need to say, we're going to put them in this block, and we'll help fund it. We're going to give the permitting. But the city, and this is my number one concern, is the city keeps voting against everything, hasn't voted for anything that's going to be at all useful. You just have to pick a site inside your city and say, all right, we're going to do housing first here, we're going to do tiny houses, or you could do a little micro village and do a mixed use. Mixed use when you have central services and mixed use around it, where you might even have a tent, you might have some housing first, you might have tiny houses. Those systems work really well because they're very cost effective and efficient, and they use a very small space and have very high impact. So it can be it's a very successful technique, and it can be done. But you just have to vote to do it.
I think Robert, hit the nail on the head. It can certainly be part of a continuum of care. So it's not the entire solution, but it certainly is one option to move people along a continuum, in their recovery of homelessness. But again, it needs to be identified. Where would we do that? Location. Every time we begin to talk about any solutions, we seem to get hung up on location. So until we can identify where we can put some of these things, we're going to have people continue to talk about them. Right. Forever and
ever
and really it's all because we don't have a location.
Part of the frustration I have had with the city of Sarasota is the failure to learn what other cities have already learned, and continues to make mistakes other cities have already done over and over and over, and that is very frustrating. They are learning, because of the mistakes being made, what was already known. And that to me is sad. My sense is a lot of what is being talked about is political hyperbole and diversion, and not really sincere about wanting to do it. That's just my sense. Because if you wanted to do housing first, they could have last year walked away from the county like they did, and the next week said, we're moving forward on housing first. Here's our location. Here's our money. We've identified money. Here's where we're going to do it. We're going to go ask for some private sector money development, and let's go forth and do it. Or they could create a housing first option with what Harvey's doing. Harvey has 2 or 3 projects that you could easily convert into a housing first model. With some quick tweaks. I mean, we could do it this afternoon. Wayne or I could go over and help them develop a housing first model this afternoon. It wouldn't take more than 3 or 4 hours to put together with Harvey and do it, and then just go do it. But from what I hear is the city is giving Harvey a hard time. Rather than helping Harvey, they're hurting Harvey. Or maybe rather than helping, they're we got all these questions and challenges and such. And so that's why I wonder about the sincerity. I think we got to get to a sincere position. What are you really want to do? And if you really want to do housing first, just start. Just start. There's nothing. I've been accused by a couple people there that I'm anti-housing first, and I said we've used housing first. I believe in it, especially the housing income tax credit. It's one of the great programs still exists, but you just got to start voting on it and start doing it. And I just question after 18 months of talking about it, why haven't they voted on one thing? If you really want to make big change, you got to make big changes in how you do it. I mean, and that's the biggest takeaway. If you want big change, you have to make big changes in what you do. The county has made big changes. The 3 big foundations here have made big changes. The 4th foundation is ready to help us on one of these changes. They're just waiting for the city. Agencies have made big changes. The family agencies have all come together and created a coalition. They've made big changes. The city has not made big changes yet, and that's what they need to do.